March 2026. In just a matter of hours, the Middle East shifted from escalation on the edge to open confrontation. Joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran reportedly resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and a wave of attacks on key targets, from command and control hubs to internal security infrastructure. Tehran's response came fast. Missile and drone strikes weren't limited to Israel and U.S. assets. They also hit sites across the Persian Gulf, including areas tied to neutral regional states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as British and French military bases. That targeting choice instantly reshaped the political landscape. Iran's actions effectively rallied even the players who, just yesterday, were keeping their distance and refusing to publicly back the American operation, because this is no longer a limited retaliation. It's an expanding conflict and a direct threat to regional security.
Iran can end this now.
And this is where we are today. Either this is a flare-up that diplomats and commanders can still contain, or it's the opening phase of a fight that won't stay confined to Iran and Israel and will hit the entire world through oil, shipping routes, and the risk of a shutdown at the region's most dangerous choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. Events are moving minute by minute, but the overall shape is already clear. After the joint U.S.-Israeli strike on February 28th, the campaign against Iran did not end with a first wave. According to international reporting, strikes have continued into a second and third day, and the logic behind them is not symbolic, it's systematic. The goal is to degrade command and control nodes, air defense elements, missile infrastructure, and anything that could give Iran staying power in a prolonged conflict. In parallel, a second track has kicked in: internal destabilization. The death of the supreme leader pushes Iran into a high-risk period: succession, the balance of power between the clerical establishment and the IRGC, fear of elite fragmentation, and the need to keep the streets under control. This isn't just a personnel issue. It directly affects how quickly the regime can make decisions, and whether it can keep a functioning chain of command under wartime pressure. At the regional level, the conflict has already moved beyond the Iran-Israel axis. Iran's retaliatory strikes and the activation of allied armed groups are opening up additional fronts. We're seeing a widening exchange of attacks involving neighboring countries and Western military infrastructure. Reports include strikes on sites in Gulf states and attacks on Western points of presence, while tensions are also rising on the northern track through the Lebanon factor and strikes against connected networks and structures. The third layer is maritime and energy security. Markets aren't reacting to emotion, they're pricing logistics risk. Fears of supply disruptions and complications to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz are already showing up in price spikes and scenarios for a broader oil and gas shock. Even a partial disruption of transit acts like an inflation accelerant and a direct pressure point on the global economy. Finally, diplomatically, pressure is building to contain the fire. Governments across the EU and the UK are publicly calling for de-escalation and moving to protect their interests and personnel in the region. But on the ground, the logic of the military phase still dominates. Iran's response over these days doesn't look like impulsive revenge. It looks like an attempt to seize back the initiative fast and force its opponents into a more complicated, sticky kind of war. After the U.S.-Israeli strike and the reported death of the supreme leader, the regime is operating in a reality where showing weakness is dangerously costly. At home, it needs to project control and resolve. Abroad, it needs to send a message that the price of this conflict will keep rising for everyone. That's why Tehran is choosing to widen the battlefield. The strikes aren't limited to Israel or U.S. targets. Iran is deliberately spreading the conflict across the region, hitting infrastructure and sites tied to Western military presence and Persian Gulf logistics. The point isn't that these targets are simply easier to reach. The point is that it changes the psychology of the crisis. For neighbors and neutral players, the illusion that the war is nearby but not here starts to collapse. The risk becomes shared, and that's exactly what Iran is trying to turn into leverage, pressuring outside actors to demand a halt to the operation and push for new negotiations. At the same time, Tehran reaches for its most sensitive lever, the sea, energy, and supply routes. What scares markets in the Middle East isn't slogans, it's the possibility that tankers and shipping corridors end up under threat. Even the faintest hint of instability around the Strait of Hormuz can translate instantly into higher prices, supply fears, and nervous decisions by traders and governments. Iran understands this. If you can't beat the United States in a direct military duel, you try to make the conflict itself so expensive and so dangerous to the broader system that your opponent starts looking for an exit. But this strategy has a built-in downside. The wider Iran spreads its strikes, the fewer gray zones remain for countries that were trying to stay on the sidelines. And instead of fracturing the coalition, Tehran risks triggering the opposite effect, pushing even hesitant players toward a shared line against Iran, because now they're no longer defending someone else's operation, they're defending their own security. If you look at what's happening with a cold eye, the United States and Israel are playing different but complementary roles. Israel is the spear point, intelligence, targeting, tempo, and a willingness to hit threat infrastructure before it fully comes online. The United States is the frame of the conflict. Scale of forces, long-range air power and naval assets, logistics, allied cover, and risk management, keeping this from turning into an uncontrolled chain reaction across the entire region. In Western terms, the operation is presented as an effort to strip Iran of key capabilities, especially missile capacity, and break the regime's ability to sustain a long war.
That this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again.
They can never have a nuclear weapon.
But the most important question is who got pulled in besides them. By widening the geography of its strikes, Iran effectively brought more players into the fight than anyone expected in the first 24 hours. After attacks on sites in areas linked to Gulf states, European capitals can't afford the posture of a distant observer. Press reporting suggests the UK gave the US access to British bases for strikes tied to the missile threat, and then Britain itself reportedly faced an attack on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. At the same time, leaders in France, Germany, and the UK publicly condemned Iran's strikes as dangerous and indiscriminate, diplomatic language that usually precedes tighter defense measures and closer coordination with Washington. On the other side is Iran's axis. Tehran can't deliver a direct, symmetrical response to US power, so it leans on a network of partners and proxies built to stretch the battlefield. Pressure from the north through the Lebanon track, threats to maritime routes, and strikes on bases and infrastructure across the region via aligned groups. In that sense, Iran is trying to turn the war into a mosaic, multiple pressure points instead of a single front. And that creates a paradox. The harder Iran swings wider, the faster an informal defensive coalition takes shape, even among actors who just yesterday refused to publicly support the American campaign. Still, that defensive coalition isn't a single solid bloc. As the stakes rise, some US partners aren't looking to broaden the war, they're trying to compress it in time. According to Western press reporting, the UAE and Qatar are privately urging partners to pressure Washington, so Trump limits the scope of the campaign and shifts the situation onto a diplomatic track sooner. The logic is blunt. Even if Iran is a real security problem, a prolonged conflict could cost the region more than any political compromise through energy prices, investor fear, tourism collapse, insurance spikes, and direct risk to ports and aviation hubs. And then there's the detail that genuinely shocked the world: strikes on Dubai, something the region avoided at almost any cost for decades. Dubai has long been treated as a neutral showroom of the global economy, a place most crises tried to root around. But once it gets hit, this stops being just military escalation. It becomes a message to markets. There are no safe zones anymore. That's why many Gulf states are simultaneously strengthening their defenses and pushing hard for restraint, not out of weakness, but because the war is turning into a direct threat to their core asset, stability, and economic credibility. From here, the story can move along several trajectories, and the critical point is that outcomes won't be decided by missiles and airstrikes alone, but by who decides to stop first, and who can sell that decision as a win. Scenario 1. Rapid de-escalation driven by fear of a larger war. After strikes on infrastructure, and especially after hits on the region's economic showcase targets, pressure on Washington and Tel Aviv will intensify, not out of humanitarian concern, but out of cold math: oil, insurance, logistics, and investment risk. In this version, the US and Israel lock in the result as neutralizing key threats, while Iran frames it as inflicting pain and preserving sovereignty. At the same time, a diplomatic corridor opens through intermediaries, giving both sides a way to step back without losing face. Scenario 2. A prolonged, low-intensity war. The main battle may feel like it already happened, but the region slides into a new normal of constant strikes. Iran leans harder into asymmetry, proxy operations, attacks on bases and maritime routes, periodic missile and drone waves. The West answers with precision strikes, cyber operations, and a steady hunt for stockpiles and command nodes. On the surface, it looks like a managed conflict. In reality, it's an endless crisis that repeatedly spikes energy prices and forces regional states to spend billions on defense. Scenario 3. A sharp escalation into a full regional fire. This kicks in if a single episode occurs that can't be smoothed over. Major American casualties, a hit on critical Gulf infrastructure, a serious maritime incident, or an air defense mistake with mass casualty consequences. At that point, the diplomatic window slams shut, and the operation turns into a sustained campaign that pulls in new players, not by choice, but by necessity. And then there's the highest risk variable of all, Iran itself. If the power struggle after Khamenei's death spirals into chaos, the regime could become both more aggressive and less controllable. That's the worst combination for everyone: more weapons, more panic, and less discipline over decisions. This is where Washington faces a cold but logical choice. If Iran's internal system is cracking and becoming harder to predict, the US gains an argument for not ending the operation immediately. Raise the stakes and extend the military phase for another 2 to 3 weeks, aiming to degrade as much of Iran's warfighting capacity as possible, while the opponent is disorganized and coordination is weaker. In that logic, the risk of extending the campaign looks acceptable, because the alternative is an Iran that survives, adapts, shifts into underground mobilization, and comes back later more dangerous, hardened by experience and ready for the next cycle of buildup. For the US, that turns into a strategic calculation, not an emotional one. If Iran remains a threat in any scenario, then it's better to tackle it now, while the window of opportunity is still open. March 2026 has already become a moment that every defense ministry and every intelligence service in the world will study, because this isn't only about Iran and Israel. It's about how fast a local crisis can turn into a systemic shock for an entire region and the global economy. We've just watched things happen that not long ago were considered a red line. Strikes on Western infrastructure and bases, a widening attack footprint, and hits on Gulf state territory, including Dubai, which for years was treated as almost untouchable, a safe zone for stability and business. Right now, the sides are standing at a crossroads. Either the next few weeks bring an effort to compress the war and stop it through diplomatic channels, locking in results and stepping back, or the conflict keeps expanding into an attritional campaign where every new strike raises the risk of a major regional war. For the US and Israel, the objective isn't simply to respond. It's to close the threat in a way that prevents Iran from quickly rebuilding and returning to its old pressure model. For Iran, the objective is to prove it can keep raising the cost of the conflict for everyone around it and force the world to shut the operation down. But the core takeaway is simple. After this escalation, there is no going back to how it was. Every decision from here will be made under one reality. War has stopped being theory and has become a lived fact, one the region and the world will have to deal with. So here's the question for you. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, what looks more realistic? A push toward de-escalation and negotiations, or the US and Israel going further, raising the stakes toward the complete dismantling of the regime? And where do you think the line is? The point where the cost of victory becomes too high.